On Halloween night in 1988, a 7-year-old girl disappeared while trick-or-treating on Hawthorne Lane. Her tiara was found in the gutter, her flashlight still on, sat beside a half-filled candy bucket, and her pink bike was left spinning on the sidewalk. After that, nothing. For 26 years, her mother never stopped searching. But it wasn't until a demolition crew tore into the foundation of a crumbling house that the silence was finally broken, starting a search for a truth more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Before I begin, thank you for watching Minority Struggles. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The autumn of 1988 painted East Elmbrook, New Jersey, in hues of amber and rust, the air crisp with the scent of decaying leaves and the faint, sweet promise of wood smoke. Hawthorne Lane, a street of modest, hopeful duplexes and aging maple trees, buzzed with the low hum of suburban life. Children's laughter, the rhythmic squeak of a porch swing, the distant bark of a dog. These were the sounds that wove the tapestry of Carla Whitaker's world. A world that had, at its vibrant center, her 7-year-old daughter, Melanie Joy. Melanie was a spark of a girl, all missing front teeth, scraped knees, and a laugh that could make the sternest neighbor crack a smile. She loved the color yellow, the feel of glitter glue on her fingers, and the way her plastic princess tiara caught the light. That Halloween, she was a sunbeam in a store-bought princess dress, her excitement a palpable force as she bounced on the balls of her purple sneakers, pumpkin-shaped candy bucket already swinging. Carla, standing in the doorway of their small apartment, a rented half of a duplex that always smelled faintly of her daughter's strawberry shampoo, watched her go. "Stay with your cousins, Mel. Don't you want her off, you hear?" The words were a familiar refrain, a mother's gentle tether. Melanie had just giggled, a flash of that toothy grin, before darting off to join the small, costumed horde already gathering on the sidewalk, their voices shrill with anticipation. That was the last time Carla saw her daughter smile. The initial hours were a slow creep of unease, not panic. Halloween nights were chaotic, children darting from house to house like fireflies. Her cousins, older and more interested in maximizing their candy haul, assumed Melanie had tired early and gone home. Carla, busy handing out her own meager offering of sweets, assumed Melanie was still with them, lost in the thrill of the night. It wasn't until the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows and the last of the trick-or-treaters had retreated into the warmth of their homes that the cold knot of fear began to tighten in Carla's stomach. A few calls, first casual, then increasingly frantic, confirmed Melanie wasn't with her cousins, nor had she been seen by any of the other parents on the block. The police, when they finally arrived after what felt like an eternity of unanswered calls, were a study in weary indifference. 2 officers, their faces illuminated by the flashing blue and red lights that seemed to stain the ordinary street with something sinister, listened to Carla's breathless, fragmented account. One of them, a portly man whose name Carla would never remember, had sighed, a sound heavy with the accumulated boredom of too many domestic calls and petty disturbances. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice devoid of urgency, "it's Halloween. Kids pull pranks. She's probably at a friend's house, trying to scare you. Give it a few hours, she'll turn up when she gets hungry." Carla had stared at him, the words like a physical blow. "My daughter is 7, she'd managed, her voice trembling. She wouldn't just disappear. Something is wrong." But her pleas, the desperate pleas of a black mother on a street that rarely saw a police cruiser unless something was already broken, seemed to evaporate into the cold night air. They took a cursory report, promised to keep an eye out, and left. The initial neglect, the subtle dismissal of her fear as maternal hysteria, was the first layer of the silence that would come to define Carla's life. It was the quiet, insidious way the system often worked in neighborhoods like East Elmbrook, when the child missing wasn't from a family with a louder voice, a wider face. The days that followed were a blur of raw-edged panic and futile searching. Volunteers from the neighborhood, mostly other mothers, combed the nearby woods, their calls of Melanie swallowed by the indifferent trees. Flyers with Melanie's school picture, that bright, hopeful smile now a source of unbearable pain, were stapled to telephone poles, their edges soon curling and stained by rain. The police investigation, when it finally gained a modicum of traction, was hampered by the initial delay, by the rain that washed away any potential scent trails, by the sheer ordinariness of the crime. No witnesses, no ransom note, no struggle, just a small, plastic tiara found glinting in the gutter near the corner, her half-filled candy bucket sitting upright beside it, as if she'd just set it down for a moment. Her little pink bike, the one with the streamers on the handlebars, was found on its side a block away, one while still slowly spinning in the crisp autumn air. And then nothing. The silence of those first few weeks solidified, hardening into the brutal, unyielding silence of years. 26 years. A lifetime. Carla's world shrank until it was composed only of Melanie's absence. The small apartment on Hawthorne Lane became a mausoleum, Melanie's room untouched, a shrine to a childhood frozen in time. The butterfly stickers on the dresser, the crayon drawings taped to the wall, the faint indentation on the pillow where her small head had once rested. These were Carla's daily tortures, her constant companions. She moved once to a different town, hoping to escape the ghosts, but the silence followed her, a suffocating blanket. She moved back to East Elmbrook a year later, to a different, smaller apartment, unable to bear being too far from the last place Melanie had been. Hope, that cruel, resilient weed, withered slowly, painfully. Anniversaries. Melanie's birthday, the day she disappeared, were days Carla simply endured, locked in her apartment, the curtains drawn, the phone unplugged. Friendships frayed, strained by Carla's inability to speak of anything but Melanie, by their inability to understand a grief that had no end, no funeral, no grave. She drifted through a series of low-paying jobs, her focus fractured, her energy sapped by the constant, internal hum of sorrow. The world moved on, seasons changed, children grew up, but Carla remained tethered to that Halloween night in 1988, a prisoner of a single, unbearable moment. The question what happened became the silent scream that echoed in the hollow chambers of her heart, a question the world had long since stopped trying to answer. The silence was not just the absence of Melanie. It was the absence of answers, the absence of justice, the absence of a path forward. It was the crushing weight of a life stolen, and a life irrevocably broken. The summer of 2014 was a sweltering, indifferent beast in East Elmbrook. 26 years had passed since Melanie Joy Whitaker had vanished into the Halloween night. 26 years that had eroded Carla's youth, her hope, her very sense of self, leaving behind a woman hollowed out by grief, a quiet shoreline against which the relentless tide of her daughter's absence crashed daily. The city, too, had changed. Neighborhoods shifted, buildings rose and fell, and the sharp, specific pain of Melanie's disappearance had long faded from public memory, becoming just another sorrowful footnote in the town's history, a ghost story whispered by those old enough to remember. Miles away from Carla's quiet, shadowed apartment, in a forgotten, derelict corner of the city, a different kind of disturbance was underway. A small, dilapidated house on Lyndale Street, a structure that had sagged under the weight of years of neglect and foreclosure, was finally slated for a gut renovation. It was a forgotten place, its windows boarded up like blind eyes, its yard a tangle of weeds and rusted debris. The kind of house that people hurried past, the kind that seemed to emanate a palpable sense of decay. A local contractor, Simon Adler, a man whose hands were calloused from decades of wrestling life back into such forgotten structures, had won the bid. His crew, a mix of seasoned laborers and younger men eager to learn the trade, moved through the house with a practiced efficiency, their voices and the clang of their tools a stark contrast to the building's long, sepulchral silence. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp plaster, black mold, and the ghosts of lives long since departed. Plywood sheets covered gaping holes in the walls, and the floors creaked ominously underfoot. It was on a Tuesday, the sun beating down with a merciless intensity, that the silence of the past was truly broken. Two of Adler's younger workers, Marcus and Deshawn, were tasked with ripping up the warped, stained linoleum in what had once been a small kitchen at the back of the house. The linoleum, patterned with faded yellow roses, peeled away in sticky, resistant strips, revealing a layer of rotting plywood beneath. That too came up, splintering and protesting, exposing the rough, uneven concrete of the subfloor. It was Deshawn who saw it first. He'd been scraping at a discolored patch of concrete near where the back door had once been, clearing away decades of accumulated grime and adhesive residue. He paused, his scraper clinking against something that wasn't just rough concrete. He knelt, squinting in the dim light filtering through a grime-streaked window. "Hey, boss," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Come check this out. Looks like someone carved something in here." Simon Adler ambled over, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He peered down at the spot Deshawn indicated. At first, it was hard to make out, the markings faint, almost lost in the texture of the concrete. But as he looked closer, his breath caught in his throat. Etched into the surface, crudely scratched, as if with a nail or some other sharp, improvised tool, was the unmistakable outline of a small hand. The fingers were splayed, the lines hesitant but clear. And next to it, two words, stark and chilling in their possessive simplicity. Mine. 1988. A sudden, uncomfortable quiet fell over the small group of workers who had gathered around. The jovial banter of moments before evaporated, replaced by a shared sense of unease. This wasn't the usual graffiti or random vandalism they sometimes encountered. This felt different, darker. The date, 1988, hung in the air, a specific point in time plucked from the anonymity of the past. Simon Adler, a man not easily rattled, felt a cold prickle run down his spine. He'd seen a lot in his years of renovation. Sad remnants of broken lives, forgotten belongings, the quiet desperation of poverty. But this felt like a deliberate, malevolent claim, a secret buried in the very foundations of the house. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this wasn't something to be ignored, to be concreted over and forgotten again. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the numbers for the local precinct. "Nobody touch anything," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm calling this in." The call set in motion a chain of events that would, after 26 years, drag Melanie Whitaker's name back from the abyss of cold cases. Detectives arrived, their presence transforming the dusty, derelict house into an active crime scene. They photographed the etching, measured it, their movements methodical, their faces grim. The address, the date, the chilling possessiveness of the words. It all pointed to something deeply unsettling. When the name Melanie Joy Whitaker was run through the cold case database, linked to a disappearance on Halloween night, 1988, the pieces began to fall into a horrifying preliminary alignment. For Carla, the news came as a phone call on a sweltering afternoon, a call that shattered the fragile monotony of her existence. A detective, a woman with a kind, cautious voice, introduced herself as Rosa Mejia. She spoke of a discovery, of an old house, of something found that might be related to Melanie. Carla listened. The receiver pressed so tightly to her ear her knuckles were white. The words etching 1988, a child's handprint swirled around her, dreamlike and terrifying. After 26 years of silence, the past was not just stirring, it was clawing its way into the present. The mark on the floor, a crude, desperate claim laid down in concrete, was the first brutal crack in the wall of silence that had imprisoned her for more than half her life. The long wait was over. A new, more terrible kind of waiting had just begun. The discovery of the etching on Lyndale Street acted like a stone dropped into a stagnant pond, the ripples spreading outwards, disturbing decades of settled silence. For Carla Whitaker, it was the beginning of a torturous re-engagement with a world she had long retreated from, a world that now held the horrifying possibility of answers. Detective Rosa Mejia, a a woman whose quiet tenacity was matched by a deep well of empathy, became Carla's reluctant guide through the labyrinthine process of a reopened cold case. The house on Lyndale Street, with its chilling declaration of ownership, was traced back through a tangled history of delinquent taxes and forgotten deeds to a man named Eugene Connolly. Connolly, it turned out, had been a handyman, a drifter of sorts, who had occupied the house for a brief, shadowy period in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He was now in his late 70s, his mind ravaged by dementia, a resident of a state-run nursing facility on the other side of New Jersey. The name meant nothing to Carla. He was a ghost from a past she hadn't known existed. Detectives Mejia and her partner, a weary veteran named Warren Briggs who'd seen too much in his years on the force, made the trip to the nursing home. The air inside was thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair. Eugene Connolly, when they found him, was a frail, shrunken figure, his eyes vacant, his connection to the present tenuous at best. He sat slumped in a wheelchair, muttering to himself, plucking at the worn fabric of his gown. When they showed him a photograph of the house, a flicker of something, recognition, fear, passed through his clouded eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. They asked him about 1988, about a little girl in a yellow princess dress. For the most part, he was unresponsive, his answers rambling and incoherent. But then, as they were preparing to leave, frustrated and disheartened, he looked directly at Detective Briggs, a sudden, chilling lucidity in his gaze. The girl, he'd whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Too much fight in her. Had to quiet that down. And then the light in his eyes had extinguished again, leaving them with nothing but the disturbing echo of his words. Back at the Lyndale Street house, the forensic team, spurred by Connolly's unsettling utterance, conducted a more thorough search of the property. It was in the crawl space beneath the kitchen, a dark, damp hollow filled with cobwebs and the skeletal remains of rodents, that they found it. Buried beneath a pile of rotting leaves and debris, caked in mud and grime as if it had been violently trampled into the dirt, was a small, plastic tiara. It was cracked, several of its cheap plastic jewels missing, but it was unmistakably the same tiara Melanie had worn, the one Carla had found discarded in the gutter 26 years ago. Only this was another one, or perhaps the same one moved. Or had Melanie owned two? Carla's memory, fractured by grief, couldn't be sure. When Detective Mejia showed it to Carla, carefully sealed in an evidence bag, a strangled sob escaped her lips. It was a tangible piece of her daughter, a relic from that last, terrible night, now unearthed from a place of darkness and decay. The hope that the etching had ignited now felt like a cruel, flickering flame, threatening to illuminate horrors she couldn't yet imagine. Connolly's words had to quiet that down, replayed in her mind, a soundtrack to a nightmare she was only just beginning to comprehend. The lead, however, seemed to hit a dead end. Connolly was medically unfit for trial, his mind a locked room to which they had no key. The news report about the discovery on Lyndale Street, the etching, the tiara, the tenuous link to a demented old man, was a brief, local story, a flicker on the evening news, quickly overshadowed by more current tragedies. But for one elderly woman, Eleanor Connolly, sitting alone in her small, meticulously clean living room across town, it was a cataclysm. The name, Eugene Connolly, the mention of 1988, the image of the house, she vaguely remembered her late husband, Clifford, sometimes visiting with his unsettling friend. It all coalesced into a sudden, sickening clarity. Eleanor, now in her late 70s, had lived a life shrouded in a quiet terror. Clifford, her husband of 40 years, had been a man of cold rages and iron control. His work as a general contractor had been vague, his hours erratic, his associates, like Eugene, men who carried with them an aura of menace. She'd learned early in their marriage not to ask questions, not to pry into the locked toolbox in the garage, or the late-night trips from which he'd return with dirt under his fingernails and a darkness in his eyes that froze her blood. She had lived with a knot of unspoken fear, a suspicion so terrible she had buried it deep within herself, plastering over it with the routines of a carefully maintained home. The superficialities of a life lived on the surface. The news report shattered that fragile facade. As the anchor spoke, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece. There, next to a dusty porcelain shepherdess, was a silver-framed photograph from a long-ago Christmas. A younger Eleanor, her smile strained, stood beside Clifford. He wasn't smiling. His eyes, even in the faded photograph, were cold, possessive. His hand rested on her shoulder, not in a gesture of affection, but like a clamp, a silent assertion of ownership. She flinched, a visceral reaction to a phantom touch, the memory of his heavy silences, his sudden, unpredictable anger, washing over her. He had been dead for nearly a decade, succumbing to a swift, aggressive cancer, but the fear he had instilled lingered, a poisonous residue in the quiet rooms of her house. But now, seeing the news, something else stirred within her. The suffocating weight of guilt, the unbearable burden of a secret kept for too long. She knew, with a certainty that made her tremble, that Clifford and Eugene had been involved in something monstrous. She remembered whispers, fragments of conversations overheard, hushed phone calls, the way Clifford would meticulously clean his tools after certain jobs. She remembered a small, child shoe she'd once found in the trunk of his car, a shoe he'd snatched away with a snarl when she'd dared to ask about it. The fear was still there, a cold serpent coiling in her stomach. But Clifford was gone. Eugene was a broken old man. The immediate threat had receded. What remained was the image of that lost little girl, Melanie Whitaker, and the crushing realization that she, Eleanor, might have held a piece of the truth that could have brought some measure of peace, or at least knowledge, to that grieving mother. Her conscience, long suppressed, now screamed at her. That night, Eleanor Connolly, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the pen, sat down at her small kitchen table. On a plain sheet of paper, she wrote a single, cryptic line. He didn't keep her in one place. Look at the Redmond property. She didn't sign it. She sealed it in a plain envelope and, the next morning, her heart pounding, mailed it to the East Elmbrook Police Department. It was an act of desperate, belated courage, a fragile attempt to expiate a lifetime of silent complicity. The anonymous letter, arriving unceremoniously in the precinct's morning mail, could easily have been dismissed. But Detective Mejia, her instincts honed by years of navigating the murky waters of human secrets, felt a prickle of significance. The Redmond property, with a name that had surfaced peripherally in the investigation into Clifford Connolly's old associates. A derelict, boarded-up farmhouse on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades, its ownership a tangled mess of unpaid taxes and absentee landlords. It was a long shot, but the specificity of the tip, combined with Eleanor's unspoken but palpable fear during their brief, earlier inquiries about Clifford, compelled Mejia to follow through. A small team, including Carla, who insisted on being present, drove out to the Redmond property. The house stood in a field of overgrown weeds, its paint peeling, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a landscape of neglect. The air around it was heavy, still, as if the place itself was holding its breath. After forcing open a rotted side door, they stepped into a scene of utter decay. Dust lay thick as velvet on every surface, cobwebs draped like macabre decorations, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. The search was grim, painstaking. They moved from room to room, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, the silence broken only by their own hushed voices and the scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls. It was in a small, windowless room at the back of the house, a room that might once have been a pantry or a large closet, that they found it. One of the officers, examining the floorboards near a crumbling wall, noticed a section that seemed slightly disturbed. Using a pry bar, he carefully lifted the warped planks. Beneath, on the exposed subfloor, illuminated by the stark beam of his flashlight, was another carving. This one was different from the crude, aggressive etching on Lyndale Street. It was smaller, the letters more hesitant, almost childlike. Melanie J.W., it read, and beneath it, A tiny lopsided heart had been scratched into the wood. Carla, who had been standing in the doorway, her body rigid with a tension that was almost unbearable, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She stumbled forward, dropping to her knees beside the carving, her fingers tracing the shallow grooves as if trying to absorb the very essence of her daughter's touch. This wasn't the mark of a killer. This was the mark of a child. Her child. Melanie had been here. She had been alive in this dark, terrifying place long enough to leave this desperate, heartbreaking message. The realization was a fresh wave of agony, sharper, more profound than anything she had experienced since the initial disappearance. Hope, which had flickered so briefly, now felt like a cruel mockery. Melanie had been alive, yes, but she had been a prisoner, her small hand painstakingly etching her existence into the floor of her cage, a silent scream for help that no one had heard. Carla pressed her forehead to the dusty floorboards and wept, the sound raw and desolate in the oppressive silence of the abandoned house. The discovery of Melanie's own carving galvanized the investigation. The network, once a shadowy suspicion, was now taking on a horrifyingly concrete form. Eugene Connolly, the incapacitated handyman. Clifford Connolly, the deceased controlling husband. And now, Uncle Nate, a name that had begun to surface from Eleanor's fragmented, fearful recollections of Clifford's associates, a name that seemed to be linked to the Redmond property in another, even more sinister location. An abandoned slaughterhouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. A place Clifford had co-owned decades ago, a place that had fallen into ruin after a fire in the early 90s. Detective Mejia assembled a larger team. The slaughterhouse was a place of visceral dread, its brick walls stained with rust and grime, the skeletal remains of its metal gantries silhouetted against the gray sky like instruments of torture. The air still clung with a faint, metallic scent of old blood and decay, a smell that turned the stomach and chilled the soul. After hours of searching through the debris-strewn main building, a K-9 unit, brought in to search for any trace of human remains, alerted handlers to a section of the cellar, an area that had been partially collapsed and was thick with damp earth and rubble. It took hours of careful digging, the scrape of shovels and the grunts of exertion echoing in the cavernous space. And then, one of the shovels struck something hard, metallic. They cleared away the remaining earth to reveal a rust-eaten, heavy-gauge metal toolbox, the kind a mechanic or a specialized tradesman might use. It was sealed shut, not with a lock, but with thick, rusted bolts that had to be forcibly cut. When the lid was finally pried open, a collective gasp went through the assembled officers. There was no body, but what lay inside was, in its own way, even more horrifying. This was the archive of their cruelty, a meticulously kept collection of Melanie's stolen life and torture existence. There was a stack of cassette tapes, dozens of them, their labels, if they'd ever had any, long since faded or peeled away. There was a water-damaged journal, its cover warped, its pages stuck together in places, filled with a spidery, meticulous script. And there was a single, faded Polaroid photograph, tucked into a plastic sleeve. Detective Mejia, her face pale, carefully lifted the items out. The journal, she would later tell Carla, appeared to be written by the man who called himself Uncle Nate. It was not a confession, but something far more chilling, a clinical, detached chronicle of their project, their experiment. It detailed, in cold, precise language, the methods they used to control Melanie, to break her spirit, to ensure her silence. It spoke of moving her between the Lindale house, the Redmond property, and this very slaughterhouse. It recorded her reactions, her moments of defiance, her slow descent into despair. The Polaroid was the most immediate shock. It showed Melanie, perhaps a year or two after her abduction. She was no longer the bright-eyed 7-year-old from the school pictures. Her hair was lank, her face pale and thin. She was holding a single, dead flower, its petals brown and withered. But it was her eyes that seized Carla's heart when she was eventually shown a copy. They were empty, hollow, devoid of any spark, any light. It was the look of a soul that had been extinguished. The cassette tapes, they would soon discover, held hours of audio. Not of violence, but of something arguably more insidious, the systematic psychological dismantling of a child. The toolbox, unearthed from the blood-soaked ground of the slaughterhouse, was not just a collection of items. It was a testament to an unimaginable evil, a detailed blueprint of how a small group of men had stolen not just a child's life, but her very essence. The trail of echoes had led to the heart of the darkness. The days following the discovery of the toolbox were a blur of muted horror for Carla. Detective Mejia, with a gentleness that felt both kind and profoundly inadequate in the face of such monstrous revelations, tried to shield her from the rawest details. She summarized the contents of Uncle Nate's journal, her voice carefully neutral as she recounted the clinical descriptions of Melanie's captivity, the chilling references to Project Pumpkin Girl, the detached observations of a child's spirit being systematically eroded. Each word was a fresh nail hammered into Carla's already crucified heart. She listened, her face a stony mask, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bloodless. The information was abstract, a narrative of horror, but it was still at one remove, filtered through the detective's careful recounting. But the tapes were different. They were a direct conduit to Melanie, to her suffering. Mejia had been hesitant to even mention their full nature, suggesting that transcripts might be less traumatic. But Carla, fueled by a desperate, agonizing need to connect with the reality of her daughter's experience, insisted. "I need to hear her," she'd said, her voice a raw whisper. "I need to know." And so, she found herself in a small, sterile room at the police precinct, a room usually reserved for difficult interviews, its walls painted a dull, institutional beige. A single tape player sat on a metal table. Detective Mejia was there, and a department psychologist, a woman with kind, worried eyes, sat quietly in the corner. The air was thick with unspoken dread. Carla felt a tremor run through her, a deep, visceral fear of what was to come, but also an unyielding resolve. This was the closest she would ever get to her daughter's lost years. This was the truth, in its most unvarnished, brutal form. Mejia selected a tape, seemingly at random from the horrifying collection. She inserted it into the player, her movements slow, deliberate. "Carla," she said softly, her hand hovering over the play button, "are you sure? We can stop at any time." Carla nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was tight, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She fixed her gaze on the tape player, on the small, dark rectangle that held the echo of her child. Mejia pressed play. The hiss of old magnetic tape filled the room, a sound that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then a click, a muffled shuffling, and then a voice. A child's voice. Small, thin, hesitant. It was Melanie. Older, changed by unimaginable experiences, but unmistakably her. Carla's breath hitched. Tears welled, blurring her vision, but she blinked them away, her focus absolute. The recording was faint, interspersed with static and the low, almost inaudible murmur of an adult male voice in the background, coaxing, emotionless. And then Melanie began to sing. It was Happy Birthday. Her voice was fragile, trembling, off-key, each note laced with an unbearable sadness. She sang it slowly, haltingly, as if the words themselves were a heavy weight she could barely lift. There was no joy in the song, no celebration. It was a dirge, a lament, sung by a child alone in the dark, forced to perform this mockery of a celebration for her captors. "Happy birthday to me." Her voice cracked on the last word, followed by a tiny, choked sob that was quickly stifled. 30 seconds. That's all Carla listened to. 30 seconds of a broken melody, of a child's spirit stretched to its breaking point. It was enough. More than enough. It was an eternity of suffering condensed into a handful of notes. The sound pierced through Carla's carefully constructed defenses, shattering the last vestiges of the numbness that had protected her. This was not an abstract horror. This was her daughter, her Melanie, her bright, joyful girl, reduced to this broken, whispering ghost. "Stop," Carla whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please stop." Mejia's hand shot out, silencing the tape player. The sudden quiet in the room was deafening, amplifying the sound of Carla's ragged breathing. The psychologist made a move to approach her, but Carla held up a hand, warding her off. She didn't want comfort. Comfort was an obscenity in the face of what she had just heard. The climax of her 26-year search was not a confrontation with a monster, not a dramatic courtroom revelation, not even the discovery of a grave she could mourn at. It was this: the sound of her daughter's voice, stripped of all joy, all hope, all light, a voice singing a birthday song in hell. The torment of not knowing, which had been her constant companion for more than half her life, was finally over. It was replaced by something infinitely worse: the brutal, visceral, undeniable certainty of the horror Melanie had endured. The sound of that small, broken voice would echo in the ruins of her heart for the rest of her days. The drive home from the precinct was a blur. Detective Mejia had offered to have someone take her, but Carla had refused, needing the illusion of control, the familiar solitude of her own car. The sounds of the city, traffic, sirens, distant music, seemed muted, filtered through the thick fog of shock and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The 30 seconds of Melanie's voice replayed in her mind, a relentless, agonizing loop, each note a fresh stab of pain. She parked in front of her small, tidy apartment building, the place that had been her refuge, her cell, for so many years. It looked unfamiliar, alien, as if she were seeing it through someone else's eyes. Inside, the silence of her apartment, once a source of dull ache, now felt accusatory, filled with the ghosts of what she had just learned. On her kitchen table lay a manila envelope. Detective Mejia had given it to her before she left, a sanitized transcript of Uncle Nate's journal. The original was too disturbing, too graphic, Mejia had explained gently, but this version contained the factual outline, the timeline, the cold, hard data of Melanie's captivity, stripped of the journal's most depraved psychological observations. Carla had taken it without a word, her hand numb. For hours, she sat at the table, staring at the envelope. The thought of opening it, of reading the clinical, detached account of her daughter's systematic destruction, was unbearable. The audio had been a direct, visceral blow. The written words, she sensed, would be a different kind of poison, a slow, seeping contamination of her mind. As dusk began to settle, casting long, sorrowful shadows across her small living room, Carla made a decision. She took the envelope, unopened, and walked out to the tiny, barren patch of dirt behind her apartment building that laughably passed for a backyard. In a rusted metal trash can, the kind used for burning leaves in defiance of city ordinances, she built a small pyre of old newspapers and twigs. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. She didn't feel anger, not yet. That would come later, perhaps. What she felt was a profound, bone-deep weariness and a desperate need to reclaim something, anything from the abyss. She couldn't erase what had happened to Melanie. She couldn't silence the echo of that broken song, but she could refuse to let the words of her daughter's torturers take root in her mind. She tore open the manila envelope, but didn't pull out the pages within. Instead, she placed the entire unopened package onto the small pyre. She struck a match. The flames sputtered, then caught, licking at the edges of the newspaper. Slowly, the fire grew, consuming the kindling, then reaching for the envelope. Carla stood and watched as the manila paper began to blacken, to curl, to surrender to the flames. She imagined the words inside, the neat, spidery script of Uncle Nate, the cold, clinical descriptions of Melanie's suffering, turning to ash, to smoke, to nothing. It was not an act of forgiveness. Forgiveness was an alien concept, a luxury she could not afford. It was an act of refusal. A refusal to allow those words to become the final testament of her daughter's life. A refusal to carry their poison within her. The fire burned quickly, intensely, then died down, leaving behind a pile of gray, feathery ash. Carla watched until the last ember winked out. A faint breeze stirred, lifting some of the ash, scattering it into the darkening twilight. In the days that followed, the official machinery of the law ground to its inevitable, unsatisfying conclusion. Eugene Connolly was medically unfit for trial, his mind lost to the fog of dementia. Clifford Connolly, Uncle Nate, and any other potential members of their monstrous cabal were long dead, beyond the reach of earthly justice. The case of Melanie Joy Whitaker was officially closed. Insufficient evidence for further prosecution, the official report would state. There would be no trial, no public reckoning, no moment of catharsis in a courtroom. The monsters had, for the most part, escaped. For Carla, the closing of the case was a mere formality. Her justice, her truth, had been found in the sound of a song, in the image of a hollow-eyed child, in the ashes of a burned journal. It was a bitter, solitary knowledge. The world would move on, the brief flare of media interest would die down again. But Carla would remain, the keeper of a truth too terrible to share, too heavy to bear alone, yet hers, and hers alone to carry. The war of not knowing was over. The long, bleak peace of knowing had begun. The weeks bled into months. Autumn arrived, painting East Elmbrook in the same melancholic hues of amber and rust that had adorned the trees on that long-ago Halloween night. But for Carla Whitaker, the changing seasons were a distant, irrelevant spectacle. Her internal landscape remained frozen, a desolate tundra carved by the brutal glaciers of grief and horrifying revelation. There was no peace, not in the way the world understood it. No gentle solace, no healing balm. What settled over her was something far bleaker, the quiet, crushing finality of acceptance. An acceptance not of loss, but of the full, unmitigated horror of what her daughter had endured. The war against the unknown was over. Its devastating cost was now her entire world. The small rituals that had once provided a fragile structure to her days of waiting began to fall away. She no longer visited the small, unofficial memorial stone under a maple tree near Hawthorne Lane, the one she herself had quietly placed years ago. The act of leaving flowers, of whispering to a cold, indifferent piece of granite, now felt like a hollow charade. Melanie wasn't there. Melanie was in the echo of a broken song, in the deadness of a Polaroid gaze, in the ashes scattered by an autumn wind. The photographs of Melanie, the ones that had once been a source of both comfort and pain, became unbearable. The smiling, gap-toothed girl in the school pictures, the bright-eyed child in the princess costume. These images were a cruel counterpoint to the hollow-eyed ghost on the tape, the broken spirit in Uncle Nate's journal. One evening, with a slow, deliberate calmness that felt more terrifying than any outburst of grief, Carla walked through her small apartment and took down every picture of her daughter. The one on her bedside table, the magnet on the refrigerator holding up a faded crayon drawing, the framed school portrait on the living room mantelpiece. She didn't destroy them. She simply gathered them together, wrapped them in a plain cloth, and placed them in a box at the back of her closet, burying them alongside the other remnants of a life that no longer existed. She could no longer look at the child who was, because she knew too intimately the child who had been unmade. Her apartment, once a shrine to Melanie's memory, now felt stark, empty. The silence within its walls was different now. It was no longer the silence of unanswered questions, but the silence of a story told, a story so terrible that it had consumed all other sounds, all other thoughts. She moved through her days like an automaton, the routines of living, eating, sleeping, breathing, performed out of a deeply ingrained habit rather than any conscious will. Friends, the few who had remained, tried to reach out, their calls and visits met with a polite, impenetrable detachment. There were no words for what Carla carried, no language to bridge the chasm between her reality and theirs. The final scene of Carla's story is not one of dramatic closure, but of quiet, unending desolation. It is an ordinary evening. Rain streaks down the window pane of her living room, blurring the streetlights outside into hazy coronas. Carla sits in her worn armchair, the one she has occupied for countless nights of solitary grief. She is not crying. Her eyes are dry, fixed on the empty space on the mantelpiece where Melanie's photograph once stood. The wall is bare, a pale rectangle marking the absence. She is not holding a memento. She is not whispering to the stars. She is simply sitting, a still figure in a silent room, enveloped by the crushing, unending weight of her daughter's absence. An absence made all the more profound by the terrible knowledge of her stolen, brutalized life. The love remained, a deep, immutable ache in the core of her being, but it was a love now intertwined with an unbearable sorrow, a love that could find no solace, no resolution. Only the stark, empty space on a wall, an eternal testament to a life unlived and a horror that could never be undone. The silence was no longer a question. It was the answer, and the answer was desolation.